Hi, I'm Ryan F. Gassian, and this is Canada and the World, a progressive channel devoted to Canadian and world politics. I'll be tackling some of the most controversial issues of the day with an emphasis on how they affect Canadians. Please support my channel by subscribing and hitting the like button below. Remember, if you press the little bell, you will be notified whenever I upload a new video. And you would be helping me considerably if you share it via the share button. In a recent video, I talked about how global warming could drive the United States down the path of fascism and later to annex parts of Canada. Under the Trump administration, we are already seeing signs that America's institutions are failing, and while I don't think it will happen under Trump, I could see a future Republican administration making the leap to dictatorship. Yet what we are witnessing in the US is hardly unique. In Greece, Germany, and France, far-right parties like the Golden Dawn are on the rise, while Brazil and Hungary have all but fallen. It appears that the neoliberal order established after the Second World War is dying. The question is why, and what does this mean for Canadians and the future of humanity? Now, there is a reason why I focus a lot on the United States. It is not that I am blind to what is happening in Hungary, Greece, or Brazil. Far from it. However, and forgive me for being selfish, but what takes place in the United States has a direct and immediate impact on my life as a Canadian. 1. The US is the world's largest economy, and should it collapse, so goes the world. 2. It has the world's most powerful military. And 3. It shares a border with Canada. If Greece were to fall tomorrow, that would be a sad day for the people of Greece. Should the United States become a dictatorship, well, we Canadians better have some nukes, otherwise we're in big trouble. Still, to understand what is taking place in the US, we must understand what is happening in Greece and Brazil. The two are linked. Such is the case these days. Even before the invention of the internet, thoughts and ideas could spread rapidly across the globe. Look at communism. Communism rose before the coming of dial-up, and yet it found its way to every continent save Antarctica. Now we live in the information age, and everything moves with lightning speed. An idea suppressed in one part of the world will spark a revolution in another. More importantly, people are connected like never before, and this has resulted in the emergence of global communities. Something that was only possible with the advancement of the internet. An example of this is the Young Turks, an online news channel for progressives. It started off in the United States, but thanks to platforms like YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, it has become a global phenomenon with followers around the world. It can get its message out to people living in Burma, Bangladesh, Vietnam, the Congo, and Russia. And people just don't listen in. They form local communities. I once met the founder, Cenk Uygur, at a TYT meetup in Toronto for the premiere of Mad as Hell, a documentary about the network and its stalwart leader. What I'm trying to say is that politics is no longer local. Yes, local issues still matter, but you are kidding yourself if you think they are not being shaped by global events. Take the recent Ontario election. Doug Ford won because the Liberals had been in power for 12 years, and Ontarians were sick and tired of their corruption. However, why did people pick a right-wing populist over a more moderate alternative? If we view it from a global perspective, we realize that Ford is part of a trend where people are rejecting establishment candidates for outsiders. That was also what Trump was, an outsider. The same is true for Mexico's new president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Emmanuel Macron, while moderate by French standards, was still considered an outsider in his nation, and was running against another outsider, the xenophobic Marine Le Pen. To truly understand what is transpiring, we must examine global trends that threaten to bring down the neoliberal order. The first domino was the 2008 financial crisis. It was a wake-up call to the world that capitalism was failing. In a blink of an eye, the greed of Wall Street resulted in trillions of dollars vanishing. Small countries like Greece, heavily indebted and when a public sector that made up a large percentage of its economy was pushed to the brink of collapse. People everywhere were hurting, and as governments began implementing austerity programs to pay back greedy bankers, people grew angry, disillusioned, or both. The 2008 financial crisis showed that the elites didn't have their act together. They were sailing blind, as it were, and they had just driven the ship into an iceberg. Now they were punishing the average person for their mistakes. 2 years later, in the United States, we saw the rise of the Tea Party. In Greece, the Golden Dawn gained seats in its parliament. This was just the beginning, however. Other forces, like globalization, automation, and global warming, would exuberate this growing rage. Globalization is not a new phenomenon. It goes back to ancient times. Think of the spice trade between Europe and India, or the slave trade between the Americans and Africa. Countries have always been trading, driven in part by the idea that some nations are better at producing certain things than others. If Europeans could grow their own spices, do you think Christopher Columbus would have accidentally found the New World in his quest to discover a faster trade route to India? Of course, as technology progresses, the rate of globalization accelerates. Today, we live in a truly global economy. Look at the back of your iPhone. It might say made in China, but that's just where it was assembled. If you took it apart, you might notice that its CPU was built in South Korea, its screen in Taiwan, and its motherboard in Japan. The metals that make up its circuits do come from China. However, this has less to do with outsourcing and more to the fact that China is the only nation that can absorb the massive costs of processing rare earth metals, with 90% of the world's production located within their border. This could change in the coming decades, but for now, it's the main gig in town. Still, while Apple might be exporting manufacturing jobs abroad, the people designing your iPhone still live within the US. My point is that the manufacturing of many of the electronics you buy is a global endeavor. This is good because those products can be produced more cheaply, which translates to savings for the North American consumer. The downside is that workers are being laid off as their jobs get shipped abroad. Still, this is just one factor that explains why countries like Canada and the US are moving away from a manufacturing-based economy. Like globalization, automation isn't new. The Industrial Revolution saw the end of many jobs in exchange for better paying factory work, and that ultimately translated into a higher standard of living. The coming of AI promises even greater advancements and a greater life for consumers. Driverless cars, advances in medicine that will greatly improve and prolong our lives, and robots to cater to our every need. Of course, in the short term, it will result in major labor disruptions. In the United States, an estimated 8.9 million truck-related jobs exist, with 3.5 million of them being truck drivers. Within 10 to 20 years, all those people will be out of work. It will be up to governments to help these individuals make the transition to new forms of employment. However, what the neoliberal order has proven, not just during the 2008 financial crisis, but in the years since, is that it is incapable of confronting, let alone addressing, these labor disruptions. This wasn't always the case. In the 1930s, the West faced an economic crisis steeper and more systemic than the one that befell us in 2008. The FDR administration responded by passing Social Security, unemployment insurance, a minimum wage, and a job program that guaranteed work to anyone willing. Of course, FDR didn't do this out of the goodness of his heart. He faced tremendous pressure from below. Communists, socialists, and unions threatened to overthrow the system if FDR didn't address the widening inequality, which he did through taxing the rich and wealthy corporations. Sadly, these groups no longer exist. Understand, I don't agree with everything they stood for, but I recognize the importance of having a counterweight to big business and their interests. However, during the McCarthy years, these groups were systematically purged from the American landscape. Even the unions are a shadow of their former selves and are unable to mount sufficient opposition to business groups. This is why Obama only passed minor reforms in 2009, because unlike FDR, he felt no pressure from below to change things. In fact, what pressure that did exist came from above, and they demanded that he maintain the status quo, which is what Obama did when he passed legislation like Dodd-Frank. Instead of addressing the problems that led to the crisis, these bills placed minor checks on the banks, and only one banker was ever arrested, and even then he was of minor importance. He wasn't one of the main culprits who were responsible for the crash. As for the vast majority of banks, they were bailed out and paid minor, if any, fees for the damages that their recklessness caused. These weak sauce reforms angered many, and on the right led to the rise of the Tea Party. Initially, the rich co-opted the Tea Party to serve their bidding, but this was short-lived. Eventually, this rage propelled Donald Trump into power. Trump ran as an economic nationalist. He claimed that the elites were gaming the system, that American jobs were being shipped overseas so greedy corporations could get rich. He would know. He had his ties made in China. That's not to say that Trump was wrong. He was right about the system under Obama leaving many struggling to make a living. Of course, once in office, Trump went on to enrich the very corporations he decried on the campaign trail, giving them a large tax cut, as well as passing deregulation that has dealt tremendous harm both to the American worker and to the environment. That doesn't mean their marriage is a happy one. The elites don't share Trump's nationalist sentiment. They are outraged that he has slapped tariffs on steel and aluminum. They fear that his trade war with China will crash the markets. The elites would love to replace Trump with Pence, but can't. Many in the GOP see Trump as a god who can do no wrong. Part of this is because Trump has masterfully played on their economic anxiety. But it is also because racial anxiety is rising, not just in the United States, but around the world. This is something we need to understand. Believe it or not, racial anxiety has been exacerbated by globalization and the looming threat of global warming. Wars over water are nothing new. 4,500 years ago, the armies of Lagash and Umma fought one another near the Tigris and Euphrates River. The reason for the conflict? Umma's king was draining an irrigation canal near the Tigris. Fast forward a few thousand years, and we find men fighting yet again because of water. In 2006, a drought drove farmers in Syria to abandon their fields and move into the cities. Those urban centers could not handle the large influx of unskilled labor, and so we saw record high unemployment. People grew restless with President Assad's inability to address the crisis. Frustration turned to rage, and rage morphed into violence. Now Syria is engulfed in a civil war that has claimed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions, all because of global warming. Millions of refugees have since made their way to Europe, flooding that continent with unwanted migrants. Before the 2008 financial crisis, Europe could probably have absorbed the influx of refugees, but that all changed when the housing market in the US burst. Unemployment skyrocketed in many European countries, and the arrival of dark-skinned refugees made a predominantly Caucasian population nervous. Racial anxiety fueled the rise of neo-Nazi groups like the Golden Dawn. Brexit was also a response. It was basically the Brits' fear that UK was becoming increasingly brown. Across the Atlantic, North America has seen massive demographic shifts. In the United States, it's expected by 2050 that white Americans will become the minority. Many of these non-white migrants are coming from South America and are arriving to escape the wars raging there, some of which are the byproducts of Americans' intervention. As chaotic as things may seem now, they are expected to get worse. Global temperatures are expected to rise by 2 to 4 degrees by 2100. At 2 degrees, we could see sea levels as high as 50 centimeters. That would force millions of people to abandon coastal cities. At 4 degrees, we can expect crop failures in sub-Saharan Africa and South America. People will migrate north to cooler climates, causing overcrowding in nations like Britain, Russia, Canada, and the United States, as they are forced to take in millions of refugees. Like in Syria, the sudden influx of so many migrants could overwhelm the government's ability to adapt, pitting foreigners against natives in bloody civil wars that tear these nations asunder. An alternative scenario is that the native populations vote in far-right parties that end democracy and violently expel the refugees. Trump has already called the caravans making their way up to Mexico an invasion. Utter nonsense. They are women and children fleeing war-torn countries or looking for a better life, not cold-blooded killers. That doesn't stop Trump or others from portraying them in a sinister light. Now imagine 50 years from now. The world is 2 degrees hotter, and instead of thousands of refugees converging on America's doorsteps, we have millions. Unless we address these problems now, we could very well find ourselves living in a dystopian nightmare like the one depicted in my novel, Darkness in America. There, people live in squalor because of climate change, over-automation, and rampant deregulation. America's leaders don't try to fix the problems, instead just create boogeymen, pitting one segment of society against another. Sound familiar? It should. It's not that different to what we see under Trump, only far worse. The solution to all of this is rather straightforward. We already have a blueprint for its success. 80 years ago, FDR's New Deal revitalized Western capitalism. A modern-day New Deal would do the same. It would provide the following: a livable minimum wage, Medicare for all, free higher education, the latter necessary to retrain all the people who will be out of work because of automation, and policies that shift us towards green energies. Moving away from fossil fuels and towards renewables is necessary to mitigate the worst effects of climate change and slow the rates of migration. I'm not against immigration, but a nation can only absorb so many immigrants at a time. Syria is an example of what happens when you have a massive and sudden influx of refugees. The system breaks down, and the various groups begin fighting among themselves for power. So, how do we pay for all this? Simple. We do what FDR did. You raise taxes on corporations and the very rich. For this to happen, though, you require a political revolution. That means we need to remake the progressive movement of the 1930s. I'm not suggesting a communist, socialist, and unionist axis. Communism has been discredited, and rightfully so. However, a counterweight is needed to push back against the business elite. Otherwise, you can elect all the progressives you want. You can put Bernie Sanders into the White House, but he will be powerless unless he has a grassroots movement backing him up. A movement that can put pressure on lawmakers to back Bernie's agenda. Understand, a revolution is coming. The question is, which side is going to win? Is it going to be the progressive side, represented these days by Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Or will it be the side of fascism? I'll be honest, either side could win. But only one side offers a future of hope and realized dreams. The other promises nothing but death and destruction, the end of mankind. Do you agree with my assessment of how we got here? Or do you think other factors are at work? Please let me know in the comment section below, and please hit the subscribe button, as well as give me a like. Oh, and please visit my website at www.darknessinamerica.com, where you can read short stories that take place before my upcoming novel, Darkness in America. My story is about a future United States where people live in fear of inquisitors, telepathic assassins who police the populace for thought crimes.